We are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Maliseet peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between
nations.Hello everyone, and welcome to the 9th annual Dr. Agnes Calliste African Heritage Lecture. My name is Katie Albrecht, and I'm a Canada Research Chair in Health Equity and Social Justice and Assistant Professor in the Department of Sociology, and I'm very pleased to be here on behalf of the Planning Committee tonight. So we won't take too much of your time. We have a very full program, but I do want to begin by acknowledging the incredible support that we had from financial sponsors who helped to make the lecture possible. So we received support from the Department of Sociology, the Academic Vice President and Provost, the Associate Vice President Research and Graduate Studies, the Deans of Arts, Education, Business and Science, the Office for Students of African Descent, as well as X Project, the Human Rights and Equity Advisor, and then a number of programs and departments, so human kinetics, history, anthropology, development studies, and women and gender studies. The John Jerome Paul Chair for Equity in Math Education, as well as the Maple League of Universities also supported tonight's event. So thank you to all of them, and it's a real honor to have Dr. George Day deliver the lecture this evening. So the title is Black Like Me, Reframing Blackness for Decolonial Politics. This lecture is being live streamed and recorded, and I'll just convey the order of events so you have a sense of what's coming. We'll start with a brief history of the lecture, and then have the African drummers join us. There will be the Committee for Aboriginal and Black Student Success presentations of scholarships, and then we'll move into the lecture and have close with a brief question and answer period. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. John Phyne from the Department of Sociology to come to the podium.
I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight, and welcome Professor George Day, who's given a talk. Agnes came to the Department of Sociology in 1984. She retired early because of illness in 2010. I first met Agnes in the spring of 1988 at the annual meeting of the Atlantic Association of Sociology and Anthropology. And she was in the hiring committee that hired me in the department here in the spring of 1989. So almost 30 years have passed. One of the things with Agnes, when I first met her, we discussed things on race and ethnic relations. I did my master's thesis on South Africa, and we had some discussions about that. And came to know Agnes as being a pioneer in race and ethnic relations research and teaching within the Department of Sociology. She developed courses in race, class, gender, and sex, and Black African diaspora in the Americas, and essentially what's behind what we know today as intersectionality, which is discussed not only in sociology but in other disciplines. Agnes was also heavily involved in research, Black African porters in Canada, railway porters. She also did research on nurses in Canada and immigrants, domestic immigrants from the Caribbean. Black families in Canada, and she also was involved in research on anti-racist organizing. Agnes was essentially the person who put this lecture series together. Although this is the 9th year that we have the Dr. Agnes Calliste African Heritage Lecture Series, it is essentially a lecture series that is almost 3 decades old. I remember watching Agnes with the administrative assistants in the department, particularly Dr. Carla Haley Baxter, organizing this talk every year for well over a decade before Agnes could no longer do it. So when Agnes was no longer able to teach or do the lecture series in the fall of 2010, we decided as a department, in acknowledgement of Agnes's work, to keep this lecture series going. And so around that time, we struck a committee which involved just people within the Department of Sociology, the Black Student Advisor, students from the Black Student Society, and the Equity Officer at that time. And one of the students on that first committee is here tonight, Morgan Gero. And Morgan is here with her drumming troupe. And so what I would like to do right now is to turn things over to Morgan Gero and the Antigonish Cultural and Academic Enrichment Program drummers. Did I get that right?
I feel pretty confident in saying that we have probably been on this stage more than anybody since this building has been built. I feel pretty confident in saying that. So we are, I guess we're using the CAEP drummers for tonight. We have our youngest member, Ava, who's in grade 3. Raise your hand, Ava. Give a wave, Ava. And we have our oldest member, who is in first year university, Brianna. And we've got members anywhere from grade 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 11. So these are, we have 14 here today, but we usually have 20. Some of them are sick, and I just want to give a big shout out to these guys because their dedication and their leadership is unreal and unparalleled. They've been all over pretty much Antigonish this past month for African Heritage Month, sharing their talents, and with that comes with a lot of great dedication and practicing and lugging drums back and forth and late nights. So I just want to acknowledge the leadership and the dedication that they bring to this group. I'd also like to acknowledge the parents and the community members that are in the room tonight. Because behind these great drummers are the parents that are dropping them off and picking them up and making sure they're at practices and trying to catch buses and making sure that they're here. So, and the community members that rally behind these guys who are helping lug drums back and forth and putting their name out there. So it truly takes a village. So I just want to acknowledge you guys too for making these guys who they are. So we're going to, for the first time, I think, since we started, or I started this group, I actually have a group of beginner drummers. I haven't had a group of beginner drummers probably since I started however many years ago. So I'm going to call those beginner drummers forward, and they're going to play a little piece before the senior and junior members come back to play.
On this song, Isaiah is going to be the leader. So he's going to lead. at the end. Maya's going to be saucing it up a little bit, I'm sure. Marcel's going to be saucing it up a little bit, I'm sure. So we'll end with Conga, one of our favorites. Yogi?
It is now my pleasure to introduce members of the Committee for Aboriginal Black Student Success, or CABS, to facilitate this year's awarding of the Black Leaders Bursaries. The committee co-chairs, Jonathan Langdon, Lorraine Reddick, and Mike Taylor, will facilitate this process. Members of the committee, including Morgan Gero and Michael Steins, and former student of Dr. Agnes Calliste, Jennifer Desmond, are also on hand to share remarks.
Thanks very much. So just before we turn to the bursary, I just want to take advantage of this moment to say a little bit about the Committee on Aboriginal Black Student Success. It's a committee that is about 15 years old and has been a space that has been trying to build stronger relationships between StFX and the Aboriginal or First Nations community near here, and also the African Nova Scotian communities near here. So we have 3 co-chairs of this committee. I'm the campus co-chair, and Lorraine, do you want to?
I guess I'm the community.
Yeah, one of the
One of the community. Lorraine Reddick, yes. Do you want me to tell me right now? Mike?
Yeah. I'm too loud anyways. I'm Mike Taylor. I'm from Buckingak. They call me the elder of Buckingak Butts. I just started, 3 years ago? And then this year I finally decided, they asked me to be a co-chair. So I wanted to help our community and all the Aboriginals that come to StFX as much as we can.
Okay.
I'll just add that this committee is really interested in making sure that students from Aboriginal and Black backgrounds who come to this university have a fantastic experience at this university, and that's really what we're trying to work for, but also to bring a stronger relationship between the university and communities. It's a volunteer committee. This is not an official committee of the university. It's something that we all feel strongly about. There's about 60 members of this committee. Can everybody who's a CABS member put up your hand in this room? Okay. So you can see there's lots of CABS members around this room. And so as part of that effort, several years ago, we started a Black Leaders Fund. So Lorraine's going to talk about that.
Thanks, John. Well, we had some members that were dedicated members of the committee for years, and 2 of our members that were on the board at that time had passed on. So we decided that we would do a Black Leaders Community Bursary. And it's every year we kind of dedicate it to someone else in the community that has passed on. So there's many in the Black community that has passed on throughout the year, since the last Agnes Calliste lecture. So this year we're kind of more or less dedicating this one to Dr. Agnes Calliste. So, and honor to all those other people that have passed, too many to name here tonight, but still in all, that's what the bursary was. The reason for the CABS committee was it started, I remember years ago when I first joined the committee, it was because through the nursing department, they came and had this need that they said there was not enough African Nova Scotian and Aboriginal students applying for nursing. So it has evolved since that. There's many more things that we deal with, but that was the main reason why we got together. And we're always looking for new members. So if anyone feels the need that they need to, for that issue of trying to make life better on campus and off campus, I work as a student support worker for the Strait Region for Education Center now. It's changed its name, of course. So, and I work with youth every day, and I see the need that has to be, we have to start from grade primary, not at high school, not at university. We have to start at grade primary, mostly to make our students build up their confidence and their self-esteem in order for them to go on in life and be what we want our students, all students, to be. So if you feel like joining our committee anytime, we rehearse this guy, just get in touch with John and myself. Thank you very much. So we have the honor that we're going to present these bursaries tonight to 3 students that have made application, and we're going to be presenting tonight.
So we wanted to ask a couple other members of the committee to come up and help with giving these awards out. Morgan, do you want to come up? And Wendy, do you want to come join us? Can you hold that? I'm just
Yes.
going to check.
We have the names.
So.
And our first bursary tonight goes to Miss Diamond, and I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, Mr. Diamond Lajoie.
I think Diamond's not here, is he? No. Is he not here? Midterm, he has a midterm, okay. Yeah.
So our second recipient tonight is Chantel Desmond. Also couldn't make it tonight.
And a third recipient, she better be here because she's my daughter. Tara Reddick. Tara's in her third year. Well, she's been in a lot of other things. So. Okay. Do you want to get on the end?
Okay, you want to be? Oh, they're handing me the mic. I'd just like to say thank you. I'm very honored to accept this award. It means a lot to just be here in honor of Agnes Calliste. I knew Agnes Calliste since I was just knee-high to a grasshopper, and I can attest that she's been a mentor to me. And there's quite a few Black women in Antigonish that have been mentors to me and continue to be. Pat Skinner was one of them. Agnes, Dr. Dorothy Thompson, my mom. I have current mentors, Jennifer Desmond, who's an educator, Morgan, Kelsey Jones. There's lots of Black women that continue to be inspirations for me here, right in the town of Antigonish, which is great. So I just like to say thank you to the committee for selecting me, and here's to many more years of study and just prosperity, and yeah. And my future goals are to become a teacher. I have a long way to go, but that's what I want to do.
Great, thank you so much. I'd like to now invite Dr. Jeff Orr to the podium.
Thanks, Katie, and welcome everyone. It's my distinct privilege and honor to introduce George Sefa Dei. Ghanaian-born, George Sefa Dei is a renowned educator, researcher, and writer who's one of Canada's foremost scholars on race and anti-racism studies. In June of 2007, Professor Dei was installed as a traditional chief in the new Juban traditional area of Ghana. His stool name is Nana Oduse Sefa Twenobua. He's a widely sought-after academic, researcher, and community worker whose professional and academic work has led to many Canadian and international speaking invitations in the United States, Europe, and Africa. Currently, he's Professor of Social Justice Education and Director of the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies at the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, which mercifully has a good acronym, OISE-UT. Professor Dei is the 2015, 2016, and 2018 Carnegie African Diasporan Fellow. In August of 2012, Professor Dei also received the honorary title of Professor Extraordinaire from the University of South Africa. In 2017, he was elected as Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, which is a distinct, special, and the highest honor, academic honor in Canada. He also received the 2016 Whitworth Award for Educational Research from the Canadian Education Association, awarded to the Canadian scholar whose research and scholarship have helped shape Canadian national education policy and practice. He's the 2019 Paulo Freire Democratic Project of Chaplin University Social Justice Award winner. Professor Dei has written 31 books and over 70 refereed journal articles he has to his credit. Furthermore, and I can say from a very personal, professional position, George is a very generous and encouraging supporter of new scholars of race relations, and in particular, people of African ancestry. In addition to his internal support for scholars at OISE, he served as an external reviewer for a number of graduate students here at StFX, and it gives me great pleasure and tremendous honor to welcome Dr. George Sefa Dei.
Thank you, Jeff, for the introduction. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the land on which we are and the magnanimity of Turtle Island indigenous peoples for welcoming us here. In Mozambique, there's a saying that every land is a space that people have to fight to liberate. And so the land is so important to us. I also want to acknowledge the ancestors who continue to guide us and the elders, absent and present, for their strength and their encouragement. I also want to thank everyone who had a hand in bringing me here. I can't mention names, but I should mention Katie Albrecht for all the work that she did to get me here. And of course, you, the audience, for coming. I do appreciate that. It's so significant. This is the 9th of Agnes Calliste memorial lecture and being asked to do it just after her passing. Many of us in the room here have stories we want to share about Agnes, but I just want to, just briefly too. I met Agnes in the early 90s when I had been hired at the University of Toronto. And it didn't take me long to see that I was in the company of a giant. Because in our first interaction when we were walking, she was holding a bag and she said, "Here, George, hold it." Didn't your mom teach you manners? Right? And I said, "No, if you had waited, I would get it." He said, "No, you weren't going to get it. I know you. You weren't going to get it." Right? But the second incident is something that I think is very solemn for me. I remember part of our work was trying to get the anti-racism secretariat going within the Canadian Sociology and Anthropology Congress, which in the past was called Leonard's. And so we would always ask people to come to our session on anti-racism. And at times I would go around and tell people, "Please come to our session," and Agnes would say, "George, don't worry, we'll be okay." And it reminded me of, I don't want you to hold this thought in your head. It reminded me of 2 years ago, a little bit about 2 years ago, my mom passed away also in Toronto. And it was very hard for me to even give some of these invitations to go and give lectures. And the first one that I started to give after she passed away, when I was picked from the airport, I was telling the person who was driving me to the hotel about how difficult it was for me to give the lecture after the passing of my mom. And she said, "No, Nana," because at that time, because of my chief status, people call me Nana. "Don't worry, you have an angel who is watching over you." It reminds me of Agnes. She's watching over us, and may her soul rest in peace. I want to talk a bit about affirming cartographies, different spaces, different lands, how we talk about blackness, and the whole question of black indigeneities. And I want to engage this as a way of a search for epistemes in dialogue, how we have conversations. And I think for me it's very, very important because I do work with students. My best teachers are students, my students. They have taught me a lot, and I always want to recognize that. And if some of us have been very, very, as Joyce King talks about, have been very, very unapologetic in our partisan scholarly work, it's because we see that there's more work to be done. That you cannot just be a scholar and not think about communities. How we build, how we strengthen communities. And for those of us in the academy, we know students can be our best communities if you mentor them, if you support them. And here, so I want to quote one of my doctoral students. The first time I tried to give this lecture, because this lecture was first commissioned by the American Education Studies Association when they wanted me to give a keynote address, and I developed the theme of Black Like Me and talking about decolonial blackness. So I gave this lecture, a bit of this lecture in Philadelphia 2 years ago. And so when I was trying to run it out with ideas, I wanted to try it with some of my students. And one of my students, Jackie Jesso, sent me this note. I hope so much to see you Wednesday. That's the day I was giving a lecture. I would likely have to drop in and out to return to Collingwood. Collingwood is one of the suburbs close to Toronto. But it would be so worth it to see you speak of such an important and complex piece. I always thought of it as being sort of your culminating piece, one that you had been building even long before your birth, like it was part of why you are here, both in the world and at the university, and all the places in between, and the risks you take, Professor Dei. They are teachings like everything else you write about and press for, and so many things you do, unquote, Jackie Jesso. I have an intellectual project. And to me, Blackness, I see Blackness as a study of the totality of Black and African people's experiences globally. Our lives, our education, our histories, our culture, and our politics. But another intellectual project is also to affirm the fact that how our bodies are read is extremely important because they do have tangible effects. And this is why we say Black bodies matter, our Blackness matter, and for sure our Black race matters. I think it's very, very important also for us to have a very curious reading of the interface between skin, body, psyche, hegemonies, and politics. And that was to take Blackness as both a conceptual framing, but also in the Fanonian sense, as an epidermal schema, how bodies are read. And to push forward what I call a decolonial Blackness, which is to say that a Blackness that subverts imperial and colonizing consciousness of what Black and Blackness have come to signify. In other words, in Fanonian sense, a re-epidemialization of the Black self in order to carry radical Black politics and to challenge a supposedly racial transcendence that is often congealed up in the valorization of multiracial identity, which is, in this case, beyond the racial animus. A project is to see Blackness as lived experiences of Black peoples and not simply to intellectualize it, but to speak of it in terms of experience. In fact, Jean-Paul Soto, in a critique of, Fanon's critique of Jean-Paul Soto, when Fanon talked about his concept of Black and Blackness, was that he had so much intellectualized it, but he was speaking about lived experience. And that sometimes the intellectualization of that lived experiences becomes problematic when it is not matched with concrete action. As another intellectual project, I think we need to validate Blackness as something which is intelligible, we can know. It's also legible, and it's knowable in terms of a racial, cultural, and philosophical episteme. That is a way of knowing, a way of understanding our worlds. Not just a Black imaginary, it's real, but as knowable public spheres and subjects. But at the same time, uphold the fact that there are different and diverse visions of Black life. So where am I coming from with this project? I'm coming from the fact that while we recognize the saliency of Blackness in contemporary social formations, there's also the need to challenge a very fixed, essentialized, degenerate, sometimes dangerous, and what Maynard recently calls the sexual criminal reading of Blackness. In other words, to refuse Blackness through Eurocentric authentication. You know us more than we know ourselves. A very insulting idea. The colonial Anthropocene, that way we are objectified. We lack humanhood. So the colonial representations, which is devoid of our humanhood, humanitas. And also to challenge the containment and restrictions of blackness to particular geographies, which is not acknowledging what McKittrick talks about, which is the sense, the subject, and the placemaking of blackness everywhere. And also the failure to draw upon the rich archives of blackness that exists globally. When Walcott talks about the absented presence of blackness in Canadian narratives, I also want to talk about the absented presence of Africanness in blackness. So to understand blackness and Africanness as coming to a sense of self and community in the appreciation of history, culture, identity, and politics. And a big part of this project is to acknowledge that blackness cannot be understood outside a conception of Africanness. In other words, to be able to theorize blackness in ways that also speak to Africa and the African diaspora globally, what I call the geographies of blackness. To make complex what blackness and Africanness mean in Canada and elsewhere by unpacking who and what is currently included or excluded in conversations about Black, African diasporas, and the intersections of these narratives. There's also the pitfalls of claiming blackness and Africanness that shame or exclude questions of sexuality, gender, class, religion, ability, disability, different geographies, and to see resistance as a defining part of heterogeneous and the multidimensionality of blackness. Gets to my point that there are different visions and readings of blackness. And to confront the unending, this is a quote from Ali Mazrui, the late Ali Mazrui, the unending, quote, struggle to conquer Black and African self-contempt, and in Fanunian sense, the psycho-existential complexes which arose as a psychological byproduct of colonialism and Eurocentrism. And to make problematic that binary between Black victimhood and the white messiah. This calls for reimagining what Raghuram talks about in terms of the new geographies of blackness, the new geographies of knowledge, as something which is varied and intersecting ontologies and epistemologies that inform our understanding of blackness. In other words, scholarship about blackness should be grounded in African people's diverse, quote, learning experiences and methodologies of knowledge generation, unquote, by Bunkin. And of course, to contribute to the search for new analytical systems for understanding the African human condition within the global Black diaspora. It's important for me to take discursive stances in this. And one discursive stance, which is very, very important in coming to understand this redefinition of blackness, is to acknowledge one important truth. The truth about blackness is that it is consequential. Because for some, blackness has meant the particular way of thinking about Black peoples and our lives. That's what it's become, a particular way of thinking about Black people and our lives. But it's also contested. It's also complex, but at the same time, very affirming. There's the power of a non-hegemonic blackness, which acknowledges the nuances and complexities, that there's no singular way of seeing knowing and defining blackness. And also to acknowledge that while we cannot conflate blackness and Africanness, we can discursively draw upon their synergies and the co-relational status of both. In other words, to acknowledge that blackness and African identity do not exist autonomously. They do not exist autonomously. And the best example of that is that racist interpolation of anti-blackness and anti-African racism. Affirming blackness as a strategic, individual, as well as community protective response to a prevailing culture of whiteness. And also to acknowledge that blackness has not always derived its meaning from whiteness. In other words, we have to separate that Eurocentric constructions and authentications of blackness from the varied and complex meanings of blackness, and to speak differently. And for me, speaking differently is to say that my blackness is African and is also indigenous. And this allows me a basis for rewriting dominant histories and narratives of Black and African peoples as occupiers. In other words, to begin to think, for example, of the notion of indigeneity as an international category. So the question of what are the possibilities of our scholarship becomes very, very important. And towards the end of my presentation, I want to raise specific issues as a Black scholar, what I see as mine and our responsibilities. But what I need to put on the table now, for example, to think about is, if I am the occupier or the settler, then I cannot decolonize. And this is because of a very important point raised by Veracini when he says, decolonization requires that the settler ceases to exist. So what questions can we ask? One question is, how do we construct Black African identities, which is outside of that which continues to be constructed within Euro-American hegemony and ideology? Also, how do we theorize blackness and anti-blackness through anti-colonial and decolonial prisms? And also to ask, what theoretical tools can African, Black, indigenous, and racialized peoples employ to forge solidarities, what we can call critical friends, not allies, but critical friends, to resist anti-Black racism, anti-Blackness, and anti-indigeneity. And also to ask how are African scholars themselves, how African and Black scholars themselves resisting ongoing misrepresentations of the Black experience. What critical analytical tools can be developed to account for Black agency and resistance? And what are the limits of such tools for anti-colonial social movement politics? To also ask, how do indigenous informed frameworks of Blackness and Africanness assist in decolonial projects? This will require understanding the synergies and divergences about Blackness, anti-Blackness, and anti-Black racism. They are related, but they are not the same, and to understand the synergies between Blackness, anti-Blackness, and anti-Black racism. There's a correlational status, but they are not synonymous. So to get to the question of how have Black and African scholars themselves theorized Blackness, it's a fact that Blackness has been evoked as an identity and experience which is shared, is also contested, and is contingent and sometimes contradictory in terms of its histories. And you see this way back in some scholars, the works of Dubois, Asante, Hall, Gilroy, Walcott, and McKettrick. There are also those scholars who have argued about Blackness as more than a racial identification, but it's about knowledge of culture, politics, history of a very complex experiences. And here we talk about Fanon, Wright, Yancey, and other scholars. Then there are those scholars who also theorize about blackness as an identification that comes with a political consciousness. What does it mean to be black in this context? There's a difference between being black and becoming black. So as an identification that comes with political consciousness, a black agency and resistance. And here others like Fanon, Cizere, Ibrahim, and many others have also raised this point. Then Sylvia Wintex, in her work, and Charles Mills, when they talk about towards a reimagining of the human, that is said the creation and the solidification of racial categories, the erasure and performativity of identities. Then the whole question of black disposability, black lives don't matter. Resisting that continuing microaggressions against black and African peoples. And there are scholars who write about this. And those who talk about it in terms of the state's disregard of black matters. People like Smith, Eunice Hill, and Gloria Latson-Bellens. And those who also focus on community and institutional anti-blackness. An example of the institutional anti-blackness is to see how in spaces such as the academy, how anti-blackness emerges. Whether in terms of our scholarship, in terms of what knowledges count, in terms of whose experiences are legitimated and validated. And then the consumption and commodification of blackness. It's hip, it's style. We consume it, but we don't do anything to address the challenges and responsibilities. And there are scholars who write on this. Then the surveillance and policing and punishing black bodies for showing up in unwanted spaces. You've transgressed. Know your place. You step in there, you need to be punished. And others write about this. Perceived black transgressions. And of course, Black Lives Matter. And you get responses about all lives matter. Of course, we know all lives matter. But who are being shot? Who are at the forefront? And those who talk about post-blackness, which I've never understood. What is post about blackness? Except to talk about it in more complex and nuanced way. And those who talk about Afrofuturisms. So Black Panther, for example, speaks from that Afrofuturistic stance. And then those who write about appropriating blackness, or speaking about respectable blackness, or aspirational blackness. And those who write about contesting black authenticity. Right? Or he's black, he's not black. He's not black enough. These questions of authenticity. And then bell hooks loving that we need to love our blackness. And also the notion of knowing, understanding what it means to develop that consciousness of the black body. And then becoming black, which is distinct from being black. Being black is an identity, but becoming black is a political consciousness. Those who write about that, and many scholars do. Then also interrogations and critiques of blackness as the way it's been conceived is very heterosexual, it's also masculine, it's male, and it's able-bodied. And there are people like Collins, Faber, Mucha, and others who write about this. Those who talk about queering blackness, for example. And also how mixed race identities complicate blackness. How mixed race identities complicate blackness. And then Christina Sharp and Jemima Pierre in their work, working through the black metaphors and the materiality of the slave ship, the wigs, the containments, the regulation, the punishment, and the narratives of horror that's attached with the Middle Passage, for example. So in sum, in terms of black scholars and our theorizing, we could say that blackness has been approached from a variety of perspectives. Some of these sometimes tend to be anti-racist, they tend to be decolonial and anti-colonial. They also come from black social movement resistances, and also those who take it from the intersections of race and indigeneity. The second point in terms of summing the black theorizing is to acknowledge that these perspectives have also taken scholarly angles of both Afro-pessimism and Afrofuturism. But what they do is that they reveal the strengths of black epistemologies, black feminisms, and the different geographies and cartographies of blackness. But at the heart of what these scholars are saying is this point, which is that there's the need to validate what black people know about their blackness. They need to validate what black people know about their blackness. So I want to offer some 5 discursive positions as a structure for rereading blackness that builds on some of this early theorizing. So the first point I want us to think about is to include Africa and Africanness as a strategic reinvention of Africanness in diasporic contexts. So to speak about it beyond diasporic blackness. When we situate Africanness in such discussions, what we are doing is that it takes our analysis back to pre-contact and pre-colonial Africa. In other words, it becomes a refusal to limit the gaze of our history, our culture, and our identities as African bodies. In other words, the world did not begin with Europe. Colonialism is not the starting point of our history. But anytime we do this indigenous reading, there's the conundrum that it offers because we want to write back. We want to write back and challenge the meta-narratives. And people read it as, oh, we are reacting to Europe, or we are reacting to West or whiteness. What they forget is that we cannot always read these discussions centering Europe as the beginning of history. So to ask the question, for example, why won't Africans have a conception of blackness which is lodged in our indigenous epistemologies? In other words, an understanding that challenges what Amy Cizere long ago talked about, the thingification and objectification of blackness, where blackness becomes a thing to be acted upon, to be reacted to. But to read blackness also in ways that speak to Africa. I think this is so important, to read blackness in ways that speak to Africa and the contemporary African subject who may decry the color descriptor. You know, sometimes we hear, and this comes from continental Africans who say, well, for me, I'm not black, right? I'm African. Well, they know they are black when they come to the what? The transnational space. They can't escape that. That the African body cannot escape her or his blackness in the context of transnational mobility. The African begins to know about her or his blackness once the diaspora confronts. And that's what Jemima Pierre talks about in terms of the predicament of blackness. And African indigenous, and I think it's so important in terms of this first level of reading, because when we look at African indigenous folkloric productions and cultural aesthetics, they still play out even in diasporic conceptions of blackness. Whether you look at it, art, their roots, where this art is rooted, where they are lodged. So even diasporic conceptions of blackness, they do rely on African indigenous folkloric productions and cultural aesthetics. But this first level of reading blackness also puts an important question on the table: what it means to find oneself and to discover a culture. What it means to find oneself and to discover a culture. The second, in terms of the discursive stance, reading, is to reclaim African indigeneity in terms of the history, the culture, identity, and politics as constitutive of a knowledge base. What one of my former students who is teaching at the University of Hawaii, Leilani Holmes, talks about in terms of the ancestry of experience. So here, there are certain things that are very, very important. The question of land is very, very important. But the land is not just a physical space. It's also a social, psychic. And that allows us to connect to the African indigeneity. So you have black bodies here who say, well, I was moved here a long time ago, and somehow that has been lost. That the physical location doesn't take away that Africanness. It's a conscious decision that people make. But what is most important in this second level of reading is the fact that we have to acknowledge African ancestral cultural knowledges about blackness that symbolized holiness, purity, beauty, happiness, anger, resistance. And what this does is that it subverts Euro-constructions of blackness and black that is seen as deviant, criminal, abnormal, and degenerate. And you can read Digasa in terms of this indigenous African conceptions of black and blackness, which is counter to the Euro-constructions of blackness as deviant, criminal, barbaric, and degenerate. This calls for engaging African-centered thought as a paradigmatic shift and intellectual subversion. It's about reading the world differently, reading blackness differently, reading Africanness differently. And this is more posited at the level of knowledge best in this quote by Debishi when he says, we are all entitled to, quote, a degree of self-centrism. However, the question is not whether non-dominant thinking, that's bodies of knowledge, can, quote, can reach a self-consciousness and evident neutrality, unquote, but rather engaging such knowledge as intellectual resistance and subversion for the main purposes of, quote, offering alternative. And this alternative can sometimes be counter, complementary, and can be contradictory visions of reality, which is more rooted in the lived experiences of black and African peoples. This gets what I was saying, validating what we know of ourselves as black and African bodies. But it also presents an idea that African peoples themselves are holders and custodians of territorial, cultural, and intellectual heritage, knowledge, and are not just mere subjects of Euro-colonial histories. It also calls for a more nuanced understanding of blackness that represents, and again, this is a quote from one of my doctoral students, Jimena Martinez, when she says, quote, the substantive vindication of African subjectivities on the map of indigeneity, whose silencing has long gone unchallenged in general colonial discourses, and particularly in academic discourses. What this is speaking to is what I call a critique of the implicit anti-blackness in colonizing the appellation indigenous. So anytime you talk about black indigeneity, African indigeneity, people want to question that. And we need to trouble that. That are called the colonial appellation of the indigenous. That indigenous can be an international category. You can talk about indigenous in Hawaii, indigenous in Australia, indigenous in Africa, indigenous in the Caribbean. Just as we talk about indigenous in terms of Turtle Island, to bring that international category. When we fail to do that, or when people challenge that, let's see the anti-blackness that is Marx in that sense. So reframing blackness in African philosophies of an interdependent and interrelated universe. So I'm here talking about African cosmology or cosmogonis, which is also to understand social reality as something which is fundamentally spirit and spiritual with material manifestations, as Carol talks about, but speaks about it in terms of ontology. That the African sense of reality is spiritual and has spiritual manifestations. And that we also, within African indigenous systems, there's the value system that prioritizes interpersonal relations, collective, communal, and community gain, as opposed to competition and individualism. It doesn't mean these do not exist in African Black ontologies. They do. But what I'm saying is that it prioritizes notions about interpersonal relations, collective and communal, and community gain. And this, when we do that, helps us to challenge an understanding of Blackness as something which is antithetical to individualism, because it's about community, it's about interpersonal relations, it's about connections that we make. The third is this important distinction that I think needs to be made, which is the conceptual distinction between a black-white binary and a black-white paradigm. Clearly, we know that the black-white binary can be problematic when you read the world simply in terms of black and white. But that doesn't mean we should move away from the black-white paradigm. The black-white paradigm is very important because it does speak to the necessity to interrupt the conundrum of blackness and whiteness. But it also acknowledges the many ways by which a closer proximity to whiteness is rewarded. The more close you are to whiteness, it's rewarded. People would like to see it in terms of shadism. Right? So we have to hold on to the black-white paradigm, not a binary, but it's a paradigm. And what this paradigm does is that it helps us to reframe blackness, particularly diasporic blackness, in the context of indigenous and settler relations, which I'll come to the fourth point. Now, I need to stress that I'm not talking about black exceptionalism, that there's something unique about black and blackness. What I'm saying is that it's very, very important to hang on to that black-white prism because it allows us to read the world. Look, you know it in my culture, where I was born in Ghana, those who have lighter skin, they're privileged, right? They are privileged. They receive rewards because they have lighter skin. They are African, they are Ghanaians like me, but they are privileged. This is that colonial thing I'm talking about, the black-white paradigm. Not a binary, it's a paradigm. It's a way of reading our world. It's very, very important. It also helps us to dislodge, to respond to the dislodging of blackness, the disavowal of our lives, our pain, our suffering, a denial of the saliency of blackness in white supremacist contexts as revealed in global anti-blackness and anti-black racism. What I'm getting to at this level is to argue that anti-blackness is more than the idea of blacks at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. It's more than that. What anti-blackness speaks to is the denial of the African humanhood, a conscious devaluation and denigration of black lives and subjectivities. We look at history and ask, what group had their humanity taken away from them? In other words, the black-white prism that I'm speaking about helps us to understand how different colonial projects are enabled and sustained by claims, enactments, and appropriations of whiteness. The black-white prism is not a negation of the colonial impact on indigenous peoples. I want to make this clear. It's not a negation of the colonial impact on indigenous peoples. It does not speak to a hierarchy of oppression, as Martinez long ago spoke about, which Andrea Smith also developed. It's simply a lens for reading contemporary society. That we can do away with the black-white binary, but we should hold on to a black-white prism. It's so important. And one reason for doing that is because the appropriation of black suffering, quote, as Sexton talks about, the appropriation of black suffering has been a template for non-black grievances. And it has remained one of the defining features of contemporary political culture. And there's a long quote that I want to give here because I think it's very important, coming from Sexton, when she says, quote, every analysis that attempts to understand the complexities of racial rule and the mechanizations of the racial state without accounting for black existence within its framework, and this does not mean simply listing it as among the chain of equivalence or returning to it as an afterthought is doomed to miss what is essential about the situation. He goes on to write, Black existence does not represent the totality of the racial formation. It is not the beginning and the end of the story, but it does relate to the totality. It indicates the repressed truth of the political and economic system. That is to say, the whole range of positions within which the racial formation is most fully understood from this vantage point, not unlike the way in which the range of gender and sexual variance and the patriarchal and heteronormative regimes is most fully understood through lenses that are feminist and queer, unquote, system. I'm getting to how we work with the black-white prism in a way that acknowledges that saliency I'm speaking about, but not to read it as the end of it all, but to read it as an important point in terms of contemporary social formation. Then the fourth level of rereading blackness conjoined with Africanness is to make a discursive shift in reading African and black diasporic presence on Turtle Island from settlehood and complicities to beginning to talk about collective implications and responsibilities, to move away from the dialogue of settler and complicities and to be able to talk about collective implications and responsibilities. And here, I'm not claiming innocence. I'm never claiming innocence in this. All what I'm saying is that there's a need to reframe black indigenous solidarities and to even talk about how we become critical friends. Black indigenous solidarities have become critical friends in order for global anti-colonial resistance and to counter the attempts to mitigate the severity of white colonial settlerhood. In other words, the word settler is about genocide. The word settler is about land dispossession. The word settler is about death. It's about that arrogance of saying that you have discovered a piece of land and it belongs to you. You can't just throw it out on anybody. Right? This shift is critical for reframing blackness in the context of histories of global social genocide and the specificities of differently racialized subjects. What I'm arguing is that undifferentiated claims of the settler is highly problematic. Specifically, what I'm saying is that the settler is not a useful concept when applied to black African diaspora in the politics of black indigenous solidarity. The settler is not just a physical occupancy of a place. It's about conquest, it's about dispossession, it's about violence, it's about structural genocide, and it's about partisan social death. Settlerhood is about colonial citizenship, tied to the domain or the doctrine of discovery, the terra nullius we discovered. It's the discovery power of the colonizer to disrupt, to destroy, to exterminate, and to replace the indigene. So let's use it where we should use it. The settler has never appeared unaccompanied. The settler is always accompanied by modernist projects in which Patrick Wolf talks about it in terms of the centralized technological, logistical, and administrative capacities of the state to dispossess and own indigenous land, something that also Glenn Coulter writes about. The discourse on black Canadian diaspora as settlers and complicit in Turtle Island colonization is guided by a competing marginalities framework. It's guided by a competing marginality. Who is more oppressed? That framework guides that. That we need to recognize the specificity of the intersections of settler, colonial, and anti-black racist logics. In other words, to be black is to be, quote, out of place, and it's not belonging. Why is that? I always get asked, where are you from? But other bodies who have also immigrated here don't get asked that question. So you can't equate the notion of settler in those contexts. Black and indigenous solidarities and struggles of anti-blackness and indigeneity have functioned within specific historical, material, and political contexts and relations of colonialism and heteropatriarchal capitalism. And it's something that other scholars have written about, like Andrea Smith, as I mentioned, Eve Tuck and Young, Hampton, Rosalind Hampton, and recently Sandra Hudson, one of my students, writes about also in terms of that. Now, settlerhood was produced through complex processes of indigenous genocide and African enslavement in their intersections. In other words, it was about systemic violent destructions of black and indigenous families and their lives. That blackness and black subjectivity must be understood as more than immigrant or property status. That our presence here cannot just simply be read as a search for capitalist citizenship. Neither can our presence also be seen as simply about exploitation of our labor. While colonialism and settler colonialism, they require analytical distinctions. I think it's also very important for us to recognize that, as Andrea Smith talks about, they are both cut from the same cloth: racism, slavery, and capitalism. And that was what I'm asking that we do then, is to critically read black and African diasporic presence in relation to settler colonialism and indigenous proposed struggles, and to insist on claims of indigenous, notwithstanding the historical, political, economic, and sociocultural specificities as an international category. And we should be able to ask this question. We should be able to ask this question and speak of implications of truth and reconciliation for black and African Canadian diaspora. We should be able to ask that question. What are the implications of truth and reconciliation for black and African Canadian diaspora? But as we ask this question, we should never forget and speak about our implications and responsibilities, because blackness has been evoked to support settler colonial projects with black implications in the development of settler colonial capitalist nation, and consequently, indigenous self-determination struggles. And this is the last level. And this is where here I'm speaking to black scholars in the audience, black learners in the audience. But I think I want everyone to hear it and find how they are situated in this discussion. I'm coming here at this level with concerns about, sometimes we forget the historic struggles that made it possible for even black studies to happen in our institutions. The lives that were lost in the struggles to make that possible. So when we talk about black studies today, let's go back to history and the struggles of those who have gone before us that made it possible for us to have that. But it also, to me, it has implications for the way we talk about black education and how we see our roles as black scholars in visioning and revisioning new educational futures for our communities. And now what I'm getting at is for us to rethink the implications of that identity. That identity, quote, a black scholar. What does it mean to be called, quote, a black scholar? The implications of that. Now, I should say that, to me, what I'm trying to get at is for us to continually challenge and to resist the entrapments of academia. We can be seduced by academia. For example, the ways Western corporate modernity interrogates, disciplines, validates, and authenticates blackness and black intellectuality. And I need to offer a caution in this level that I'm not pushing for a false compliance. I'm not saying every black scholar should follow what Nana is prescribing. I just have a problem if you do not understand that identity of a black scholar in academia. That's what I'm talking about. So it's not a hegemonic black intellectual politics. I don't care about what politics you play, but you must damn well have a politics if you're a black scholar in academia. So for the black scholar in academia, engaging our blackness means a couple of things. We need to decouple our intellectuality. We need not to decouple our intellectuality from a sociality and polity and a community groundedness. If you're a black scholar who is not grounded in a community, you will soon get lost. In other words, the study of blackness cannot simply be an intellectual exercise. Because even our presence in the academy makes us suspect in the eyes of our communities. Because these academies were not designed for us. So when they find us in here, they begin to ask, what did you do to get in? And not to become, what Namnos talks about, intellectual imposters in the academy, which is about how we mimic theories that hardly speak to our lived experiences. What our work has to be is about interruption and subversion. And to pursue knowledge that builds on our rich intellectual traditions and heritage as African black peoples, because that in itself is a necessary exercise in our own decolonization. It's a necessary exercise in our own decolonization. And to speak of an ontological existence of black and blackness and Africanness, which is beyond the question of color. In other words, to also bring in questions of gender, sexuality, class, ethnic implications in the way we talk about the ontological existence of the black scholar. But to reclaim also our blackness for a revolutionary spiritual consciousness. That is a requirement to build communities by mentoring the young. We have a responsibility to mentor the young. When you were a black scholar in the academy, to mentor the young. And also to become a distinctive black voice. A distinctive black voice that affirms the materiality of a racialized, phenotypical, and embodied understanding of blackness, but also a voice that is demarcated by gender, class, ethnicity, sexuality, and religion. And to be able to understand the politics of embodiment. And one of that politics of embodiment is to have the courage to speak race. Some of us don't have that courage to speak race because we want to be validated. I've always made the point that in the academy, if you're a black scholar who hardly mentions race, you're going to be loved. You're going to be seen as intellectual. And some of us play that role. We play that game. We must have the courage to speak race, and to speak race as it intersects with other oppressions, and also to question the epistemological frameworks we choose to work with. And as a Fanonian scholar, I also think we can and we must become academic rebels and warriors. We should not just merely be a public intellectual, or as Fanon talked about, the native intellectual. A public intellectual, sometimes what happens is that, oh, we see the microphone, we want to speak about it because we want to be validated, right? That's a public intellectual. To me, we want to be warriors. The warriors is to challenge the colonial inheritance, the colonial investments of academia, and to understand what, again, one of my students talked about, Abraham, the politics of territoriality. And that was when we get into these spaces, into academia, we don't get here simply because we are smart. Let's forget the history that opened the doors for us to get in here. And rather than simply be satisfied, we fight to make the doors wide open so that the absented presence become a presence in our community. And lastly, to constantly search for what I've called a trialectic space, a space that works with the synergy of the body, mind, soul, and spirit, because it's healing There's so much wounding that takes place for the black soil in academia that we must always search for that healing spaces, which are called the tralytic space. So to conclude, just 5 thoughts. First of all, to me, blackness must be a positionality that dislodges the security of whiteness. That's the decolonial blackness I'm talking about. Secondly, affirming blackness should be a celebration of who we are as a people. But it also must be a definition on our own terms. And by extension, it must be a response to anti-blackness and the myriad ways anti-blackness masquerades in our environments. Thirdly, let's go back to the old saying, nothing about us without us. Blackness should not just be a study about us. It must also be a study for us and by us. And lastly, they need to have a redefinition of the politics of respectability. That the way we talk about blackness also has to be conjoined with the politics that subverts in that regard. Thank you, Asante-san.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Dei. You've given us much to think with. I'd now like to open the floor to questions, and we'll have Nat will assist us with this.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Dei. My question is, how do you reconcile the fact that while all blackness can be reattached to Africa in some way, whether directly or indirectly, not all Africanness can be connected to blackness? You have North Africa in there, and even in sub-Saharan Africa, you have some more complicated places. So. Why not be more specific about Africanness and blackness to say sub-Saharan Africa, or should we even try? Because I struggle with that myself, and just the calling of African Canadians. Well, we're not referring to Moroccans in there or Algerians in there, right? So, thank you.
No, a good question. I think that's precisely the argument I'm making, which is that if somebody from Algeria or Morocco, right, do not see the connection to Africa, that's a problem, right? That's precisely my point. That's a problem, right? So if you are from Egypt and you see yourself more in line with the Arab and not with Africa, right, that's a problem. I think you can claim both, sure, right? That's precisely my argument, right? And so if you ask me, my response is the question should be put on those who deny that connection. What it is that is being said. What are they afraid of, ashamed of? Part of that has been a colonial project, which has always been trying to divide Africa in a way that doesn't talk about the community that I'm talking about in that sense. Right? The same colonial logic plays out where, you go into the schools, and let me bring it to the guy, you go into the schools, and not even the schools, you go into some homes, working in Toronto, you go into some homes and you hear parents says, oh, Professor, I heard you, that's when I used to be on TV, I heard you talk about the school system and that. The problem is the Jamaican case. And these are Ghanaian parents, African parents who are saying that. The problem is the Jamaican case. It's not our case. And I'm saying, wait a minute now. That is a problem. These issues connect. So don't separate ourselves from that. Don't separate ourselves from that. In that distance. I think that's what I'm talking about, the synergy between that Africanness and the blackness in that sense, right, in that context, right? But the question you're making is real. It's part of the colonial logic. Yes.
Hi, Doctor. Thank you so much for coming through to St. Francis Xavier. I'm a women's basketball coach here, and I'm also of African descent. I'm from Ghana as well, so shout out to you. I really appreciated the historiography that you gave in the beginning, kind of talking about where African scholarship and scholarship about Blackness has developed.
Yeah.
And as somebody who, I grew up in Toronto, and it was very, very difficult in my early years of playing sports. It was against everything my parents wanted, right, and my mother wanted. It just wasn't the norm.
Yeah.
And I was wondering why there isn't any scholarship that, where it talks about the intersection between Africanness and Blackness in sports, especially considering, I'm kind of biased in my perspective, but it's a big part of our society now, and particularly in North America with basketball and football, and the market that it is. So I just had a question about that.
Yeah. I don't know whether I can come for that. The only thing I would say is that's why we need you, the upcoming generation of researchers and scholars, to be taking up on these gaps that exist in the literature, right? And that, so you notice an intellectual gap, and I think then do more research on that, and then you speak on that. What I do know, I think the way from we take sports and Blackness here is that it's around the issues of the commodification, right? But I think if you take sports in a way that talks about the health, the healing component of it, right, then you have to go back to African indigenous systems to understand African conceptions of sports. For example, that brings in other understandings, which is beyond the material and the tangible interpretation that we put on that. So my response to you is that, yes, I think these are gaps that I think need to be filled, and that's why a younger generation of Black, indigenous, African scholars need to take up these gaps in the literature and be able to address that. Any more questions?
Hi. Oh, God, that's loud. We were talking in my sociology class about the word race and how it doesn't really mean your lineage and it doesn't really mean genetics. And it's really hard to define and is kind of an empty word.
Right.
And I was wondering if I noticed that you used anti-Blackness, where racism could have also been interchanged. And I was just curious if that had something to do with the history of the word.
Yeah, good question. I think to me, I think we've moved beyond that intellectual debate about race, right? In the sense that, yes, race may not have the scientific analytical understanding of it in terms of we talk about it's meaningless and that. But it's real. It's real in terms of its consequences, right? And I think this is how we talk about it in terms of it's a construct, but it's a construct that is real. It has material consequences, and therefore we deal with that. Because part of this is that the very people who want to move away from the concept, right, are the people who don't even want to admit that there's a problem of racism, right? How can you address racism when you take race out of the discussion, right? So to me, racism is real because race makes racism real, and vice versa, right? The realness of racism is anchored in our understandings of race. Right? It comes back to this whole notion about the color evasion, right? And by the way, race is not just about color, right? But I want to give the example of the color evasion, where sometimes what happens then is that people talk about, well, what is color? I don't see color, right? And it becomes a problem. The problem is not the color, it's the interpretation that we put on the color. The problem is not race, it's the interpretation that we put on the concept. And we cannot do away simply by wishing it away, that if you do away with the concept, somehow the problem will go away. let's deal with it in terms of the material manifestations of that. On the question of my replacing anti-blackness with, I think to me there are powerful synergies between anti-black racism and anti-blackness. There are powerful synergies between that. In fact, I've gone to the same way I argue that, can you tell me an example of anti-blackness which is not racialized, right? And it becomes very difficult to find it, right? But I think we should look at anti-blackness, which is more about a conceptual discussion as opposed to an epidemiological discussion in terms of that, right?
Hello, Professor Dei.
Yes.
I was a graduate student at OISE UT, so it's nice to see you,
Yes.
even though I never had you as a professor.
Yes.
This isn't well formulated, but I think you might offer some insight anyway. If reconciliation isn't possible at this point, because I don't think a lot of Canadians understand the history of colonization, I think something you said was really interesting about understanding history and how thinking about Indigenous and Black, the experience of Black, the colonization, the legacy of colonization for Black people as well, would have to be part of that history to reach any sort of reconciliation in this country, because we have to undo that settler. So it's not really quite formulated, but maybe
I see what you
a bit more about it.
I think look, my problem with reconciliation is that, to me, I think how can you have reconciliation without restitution, right? People don't want to talk about restitution, right? So reconciliation becomes this empty talk about, this nice, and let's all get along and let's look. We have to talk about restitution. Restitution is it's a material question. We have to address it, right? And so I was raising it in that context, but also raising it in the context that I think, given the sort of the connected histories that we have in terms of what Andrea Smith and others have talked about, capitalism, enslavement, and so forth, right? You can't talk about truth and reconciliation in the context where we have Black indigenous bodies and not also raise what are the implications for Black indigenous bodies. And I think raising that question doesn't mean we are denying the severity of issues for tertiary land bodies. No. It's just that it has to be part of the conversation, right? Precisely when you talk about what I'm raising, which is that we have to define the concept of indigenous very broadly, right? In a way that is able to encapsulate the messiness. And that part of the colonial appellation of indigenous itself has been anti-Black, right? So we always have to prove ourselves when we claim Black or African indigeneity, right? As if somehow it's lost, right? The connection to the land is not just physical, it's also psychic, right? Black bodies who are here also have a connection to the land, and it's through the seas that were moved to the Middle Passage. So some people would go to the sea, the ocean, and pay homage to that, because that's also a connection. So it brings about psychic, emotional, and cultural memories, right, rather than simply a physical location. That doesn't mean that the physical component is so important. Of course, yes, the physical component is very important, but let's have a broader definition of it that also encapsulates that, right?
Thank you.
Can you differentiate or expand on what you mean when you say there's a difference between being Black and becoming Black?
Yeah. I think, to me, being Black is an identity, right? So I'll go and talk about I'm Black, right? So example would be a racial identification. I'm Black, right, in terms of that. But becoming Black is developing that consciousness of what it means to be Black. And they are not the same, right? It's the same way we talk about there's the politics of the body, and then there's the body, right? So to me, that becoming Black is a political consciousness That comes with it. So the question that is relevant in becoming black is to ask, what does it mean to be black in an anti-black climate? Using Christina Sharp's point, what does it mean to be black in an anti-black climate? And one has to develop a consciousness to it, right? Has to develop a consciousness about it. You can be black as coached in Clarence Thomas. You know Clarence Thomas, right? You can be black conservative, and you can be a black who is radical and very, very subversive. And I think to me, becoming black is about a political consciousness of that identity. Right? It's that political consciousness of that identity.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Dei. Just like to take this opportunity to not only thank you for an incredible presentation, but to thank all of you who came this evening, everyone in the audience, and everyone who was involved in the lecture, especially the students. So thank you very much, Shanaise Lawrence and Nat Neal Tekel, for your amazing assistance throughout this process, and to the planning committee again, and especially to Kelsey Jones for her incredible leadership, and the chair of the sociology department, Dr. Linda Harling-Stalker. So with that, we hope you have a lovely evening, and please share the live stream. So the live stream's available in a recording, and it makes an excellent teaching tool too. So thank you, Dr. Dei. Sure. Good night.